technology rarely fails. Technology is rarely the reason for a company to fail. It's usually a human issue or a capital issue or a kind of, getting the cost right to work in industry issue.
Iram, what's going on?
Hey, Carl. I'm excited to talk about how biology is transforming business, technology, and culture, which we had a lot going on the past couple of weeks. It's been very dense, I will say, in terms of experiences, both professionally and personally. Wow. I mean, I don't even know where to start. Do you want to start with something? There's just so much to choose from.
Well, last week we teased the fact that we were in London for a week for the Biofabricate Fair. And then last week in New York City was New York Climate Week, which coincides with the UN General Assembly. So both of those things on their own are huge. And we were in a space together where we saw John Kerry, who had been a presidential hopeful a few years ago. And then I was downtown near Wall Street and I saw the Korean president emerge from the New York Stock Exchange. And there was a huge crowd of people taking his picture. He came out and he waved. And so that was a lot of fun. But if you're in New York City during the UN General Assembly, it tends to be pretty chaotic. But we attended a number of events. We were at IndieBio twice in one day, and you were at New Lab that same day, and that's just one day. Like there was stuff going on every single day last week. What was the highlight for you?
Yeah, I ping-ponged from IndieBio 8:30, then I went to New Lab for their Climate Futures full day event, but then went back to IndieBio for Biofabricate and Juniper's Biocultures event, then back to New Lab to just wrap it up because I live in Brooklyn and New Lab's in Brooklyn. So it was like back and forth. And there was just so much, Carl. Let's just talk about New Lab to start, because first of all, great space, hard to get to, but for those that go there from Manhattan, the hack is to take the ferry if it all lines up.
Yeah, you took the ferry, which is pretty smart.
It's super, and it's great.
So it's the only way to get around. It's a great way to get around New York City.
And it takes you right there to the Navy Yard, and it's just a few steps away from New Lab. And New Lab's a great space, right? They welcome companies that are across deep tech, a lot of energy companies, robotics, manufacturing, mobility, transport, and then they had biotech companies there too. Our friend Alex Rose was presenting Cascade Bio. They do enzyme immobilization. So shout out to all the cell-free engineering folks. Alex, good friend of ours. There's biotech companies that were creating new air pathogen detection devices. And of course, energy too. This was Climate Week. And there was a company that had a new type of fusion reactor that they were creating. And fusion was actually pretty dominant, I would say. When I was meeting people and talking to them about what they were seeing at the climate events that they were going to, they were talking about fusion, they're talking about nuclear, and it's great. I mean, energy is what drives all of our doings and happenings and everything that makes our society move. And so great conversations. One event I did go to, and I'll talk more about it later, was this Future Fungi Award luncheon. And the environmentalist Hunter Lovins was there. And this was like a luncheon for about like 25 people. So very intimate. And I got to speak with her for an hour. Like we were just
amazing
socializing. And what she said, because she looks at energy a lot, she's a thought leader in the environmental space, has been for so many years, and was saying, look, the number is 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Whatever energy you want to bring to the market, that's the number you have to get to. And so that was interesting, because then she was sharing what she was seeing in the market. And it was really funny because there's also this guy that was sitting next to us who had brought a new type of battery or energy device that he found in a lab in China. I can't talk too much about it. And I want to take a photo of this crazy thing. And it was a handheld thing. And he's like, you can't take pictures of this. And I was like, okay. And
wow.
Ultimately, the way that Hunter Lovins described it was like, is this like a semi-perpetual motion machine? And he's like, you can say that. And like, they just use like a battery and like a circuit and like a little tiny light bulb to demonstrate this. And so the battery, was there. And then they took the battery out and the light bulb stayed on for like 30 minutes. And this was just like a small circuit. He's like, well, you could do, a lot more. And I'll stop there, but it was just fascinating just to have a demo, to see things. I mean, that's the world that we need to live in. But I can go on. What did you take away from the IndieBio event?
I mean, so there were two events that I attended at IndieBio. One was an early morning event, and that event focused on expanding sustainable innovation. And we know sustainability is kind of a dirty word on the one hand. On the other hand, we know that long-term investors don't really care what's going on politically. What they care about is being able to sustain capital for long periods of time, meaning decades. So sustainability and the health of the planet is very, very important to them. And what that group talked about, which was open innovation, it included professionals from L'Oreal, from Science Co., and it was moderated by a guy from Cambridge University's innovation arm. They were talking about sustainability, but they were also talking about some of the challenges that investors face, particularly when it comes to understanding the macro market, which is something we're going to talk about today in this podcast. So I really enjoyed that event because it gave me kind of this macro view, and it confirms one of the points of view that we take on this podcast on Grow Everything, which is you need to be able to not just collaborate, but orchestrate these ecosystems so that you can go from innovation to market impact. It's not enough to be inventing something. You need to be taking this macro view. The Biofabricate event at the end of the day, led by our friend Suzanne Lee, who's been on the podcast twice, was also incredible because it introduced us to a kind of a group of new people that were not in London with us. And it also included the investor from Juniper. And I think that they are very interesting because they're a deep tech fund focused also on materials, which we know has been a very challenging space to be investing in. You were there with me, Ram. What was your biggest takeaway from the IndieBio event?
I think kind of the big thing that, again, speaks to pretty much a topic that our guest today talks about. And you mentioned it earlier about this ecosystem orchestration. And Michael from Juniper VC that was on the stage talked about new types of funding that's required. Venture capital is one way of investing in biotech, but there needs to be more. And there needs to be more collaboration. And our friend Erica Milchek was also on stage, and she talked about partnering and some of the benefits and challenges of partnering with other companies to collaborate on a product that's a consumer product. They make different types of ingredients for hair care, personal care, and they collaborated with another ingredient innovator and a manufacturer of personal care and beauty products that do end-to-end product manufacturing. So the three of them collaborated and created a product that got a lot of recognition. And they did it together. And so how can we put collaboration front and center when it comes to business? And whether the ROI was revenue or marketing value, because it got more intention because of their collaboration, there was value to be had. I mean, we saw it firsthand when we went to Suppliers Day months ago, and it was incredible to hear people talk about finance in a way that really was holistic. It wasn't just numbers, but it was how does finance function in a biotech company and actually in a biotech industry. And I thought it was well received by the audience because we had great conversations with all the attendees. I think we knew half the people in that room. We had lots of different innovators from super early stage to later stage companies that were there at IndieBio that day.
Yeah, I think we should give Erica a shout out and say congratulations to her on the birth of her son, who I think is a couple months old now. And it was great to see her there. She was the proud mama showing pictures of her baby. So congratulations, Erica. Hopefully you'll hear this. I think one other point just on that Michael made about collaborations, because Erica also made the point that, sometimes you just don't know how the market's going to react. And like they had developed a product, and I'm going to summarize, and this might not be totally true, Erica, correct me if I'm wrong. Like they've had products that they developed like a year or two ago that have taken a very long time to get market traction, but then they have other products where they have had collaborations and the traction has come very quickly. And Michael of Juniper made the point that in many cases, these collaborations either become pilots or long sales cycle, particularly when an innovator is collaborating with a big company. But the collaborations that work, he said, are the ones that use the attention and leverage all that attention into company marketing or co-marketing and co-branding. And what he had seen was seeing the use of a shared facility that can turn into an investment. And he said, if you can do a good, successful pilot with a big company, that can turn into investment, maybe not only from the company, but from other investors who see that you're getting traction.
That was a really great point. And so shout out to Michael. He is a listener to the podcast. He did say that to me. I mean, I introduced myself. He's like, oh, I listened to the pod. I'm like, oh my gosh, yay. There's a lot of that happened too. So we got a little bit of fan base. So hello to all of our listeners. That's so great to see people in person. I also had gone to, I will say, I went to this, I'm just going to keep it vague because I went to this management consulting firm had like an event during Climate Week. And I attended their Sustainable Chemicals Futures event. And it was this report that they wrote. And it was really about the sustainability part was about the manufacturing of the top molecules that are used in personal care and beauty and in food and packaging and like all the different sectors that we talk about here on the podcast. But really in the lens of the energy that's required to produce these molecules in the same chemical way. They did not mention biomanufacturing at all, whether it was using precision fermentation or using new types of energy production or new types of manufacturing, cell-free, hello, we talk about that all the time. So there's these different types of manufacturing that biology enables. And new molecules that can come online to replace some of the existing molecules that could be higher performing. And the conclusions of this report were like, oh, you need 1 trillion in investment and it's going to take this much time and it's going to be this huge lift in order to make chemicals sustainably. And I'm like, WTF, where's the biology here?
Yeah, I want to see this report so we can take it down.
Yeah, let's take it down. We're gonna put that into another podcast because I could go on because I was just like, and I wanted to raise my hand, but I was like, look, there's all these suits here, men and women, and this isn't my consulting company. I don't want to create this whole thing. And I didn't read the report at the time, so like maybe there is a section, but they didn't talk about it in this open forum, in this dialogue during this event. So let's read it. Let's digest. Maybe they're like, we acknowledge biomanufacturing exists. We're just going to leave it out of this report. But it's like, then why was that decision made? I don't know. So let's just table it. But there needs to be more biology and biotech in Climate Week in these high level conversations, because at this event, they had CEOs of some of the biggest companies that were there. And I'm like, this conversation isn't happening with these big decision makers, but it's happening here on the Grow Everything podcast.
All right. I've been going back and kind of looking at the reports that the big consulting firms have done on the bioeconomy, because I want to see what is missing from those reports and just to understand the numbers that they are proposing or predicting the impact of biotech is going to be on just the global economy. But I'd love to read this report because I think it's important for us to understand what other people are saying.
Yeah, I just want to comment though, because they might have written a report about the bioeconomy separate.
Yeah, it's worth looking at. I can't wait to see.
It's like they have these different, everything's in silos. Like they're not taking that, they think of biotech as something separate when it should be pervasive throughout all of their analyses. So anyway.
Yeah. And we know that other people, particularly banks, are looking at all of these technologies holistically. So we're not going to go into that now, but that's something else that we can talk about.
So just actually one really quick thing I did mention earlier that I attended this luncheon, and it was held by Suzanne Orison, who runs a Future of Fungi Awards. And they are now accepting applications. I'm so excited for this because I met some of these entrepreneurs, and people think of fungi in materials. They think of it as, maybe food or like functional, like nutrients. But there is so much more that fungi can do. I recommend people follow the Future of Fungi. We're going to be collaborating with them more. It's very exciting. So I wanted to give a shout out because this isn't just about an award for people that are using fungi. This is about creating a whole ecosystem to bring fungi as a resource to make so many different materials. We talk about biotech in general. This is focused on fungi. So just wanted to point that out. And this can also be a segue into ecosystem building, hopefully.
Okay. So we've been talking about ecosystem building in the context of Climate Week and even Biofabricate. And a few months ago, I noticed that a company called Samsara had done a deal with Lululemon.
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, a friend of ours, friend of the pod, Phil Morle of Main Sequence Ventures, wrote a piece about this deal. And the deal was that Lululemon would be using Samsara's technology in this 10-year plan to advance recycled materials. But the way that Phil wrote the piece was really about one of the theses that we've evolved on Grow Everything, which is the importance of collaboration and orchestration. So I contacted Phil and I said, we have to have a conversation. And we ended up having a conversation without you, Rum. I'm sorry you missed it. You'll be on the next one, because as you listen to this conversation, you're going to want, I feel like Phil and I could have gone for 3 hours. And with you on the phone, we probably could have gone for 8 because there was so much good stuff there. And unfortunately, we had to cut it short. So I'll just preface this by saying, Phil is based in Australia. I've known him for several years, met him through SymBioBeta, and we talk to each other 3 or 4 or 5 times a year, check in with each other to see how we're doing. Main Sequence Ventures is a well-known deep tech fund in Australia. And I think with that, we should just let Phil take it away. Phil Morle, we've known each other for a really long time, and I'm so happy to know you. I'm so glad that you're taking the time today to join me on the Grow Everything podcast.
Any excuse to talk to you, Carl. I always learn something new, so let's go.
Yeah. So you and I have known each other probably for 10 years through SymBioBeta, and you're down in Australia or up in Australia, however you want to look at it. And what I wanted to talk to you about today was really about ecosystem orchestration. And tell me a little bit about your background, and we'll get into more of this, but just give people like a high level, who is Phil Morle? What do you do?
Well, like many people involved in venture and entrepreneurship, I have a very odd background. We all come from different places. People think we're all ex-bankers or something, but people come from different parts of life and apply that to what they're doing in venture. And in my case, I actually started my professional career working in the theatre business. And I was a theatre director for the first 10 years of my life. And I directed a theatre company that was based in London and also in Australia. Yeah, being in theatre you don't do it for the money, let's say that. And in fact, no one's doing it for the money. You need to figure out a different way of effectively doing the sales, recruiting the team, getting that revenue, which is getting the audience along. And we'll maybe get into that a little bit later in this orchestration discussion. But some of those sort of big ideas around orchestration and what it actually is comes from that. But of course, working in theatre doesn't pay the rent. And I am a technical person as well. And so this was in the early days of the Mozilla browser, the beginnings of the dawn of the internet. And I was busy making websites for people at the time. And I was a sort of side hustle programmer. And that's how I paid the rent on top of the theatre production. And it got to a point where I needed to decide to get onto the train of the World Wide Web or just let it sail away. And I decided to get on the train. And I realized when I did that and I began leading technical teams that I was effectively doing the same thing. But when I moved from theatre to technology, I thought, gosh, I'm going to have a sabbatical every year where I go and just make some art, because otherwise my soul will be crushed. And I realized that actually I equally love bringing teams together to make other things. And again, pulling this into the orchestration debate, that there needs to be some pleasure and delight and focused in on that. What are the magic combinations that we can bring together here to make something incredible happen? And so I now go to the theatre and watch performances and love it, but don't feel like I have to create them anymore. I express myself through helping other people build these great businesses. And yeah, as I moved my way through the career, I became a chief technology officer for one of the big file sharing companies, I guess at the kind of peak of that, which is a company called Kazaa, which was 80% of internet traffic at the time. At its height, it was huge. And I really got the bug through that about working in a startup, creating something new that is very impactful globally, that you see millions and millions of people using. And I wanted to do that again after I'd completed that project. And I looked around for the next startup to join in Australia at the time, and there really weren't any. This was in the days of the kind of early to mid 2000s, and there just wasn't much going on. And at the time, Australian entrepreneurs would, of which there were many already at that time, but the path was you would go to America. And most people would very quickly land in California and start building their company there. And that's why there are many Australians and Californian startups. And so the solution to that, if I wanted to stay in Australia, was to create an organization that would create startups. And myself and my co-founder, Mick Labinskas, we created an organization called Pollenizer, which was Australia's Y Combinator, really. And that was a 10-year journey, actually realizing that there needed to be a pattern, a repeatable way of thinking about what is it we actually do when we have an idea and we want to turn that into a company. So we spent a lot of time in Pollenizer actually doing that work, actually just saying, what is it? What do we do? In what order? Who do we work with? How do we train other people to do that, to make it scalable? And of course, part of that as well is how do you actually build out the ecosystem? Because to different degrees and different industries, we can't just fund it ourselves, build it ourselves, create the supply chain ourselves, understanding what regulations are needed ourselves, and then change those regulations and all the things, like the gazillion things. At the time, there was no other accelerators. The venture capital pool in totality in Australia was smaller than one of our fund vintages in main sequence today. So very tiny amounts of capital. And in fact, in the Pollenizer days, we created about 25 companies ourselves over that time, over a 9-year period. And we did that with under $5 million of capital. So we ran a company of 70 people building these companies with $5 million and smell of an oily rag, but learned a lot. And then by the time we were done, there was no need for Pollenizer anymore because the ecosystem had risen and filled in a lot of the gaps. And I moved on to what I'm doing now, which is doing that company creation work, but in the context of science and venture capital at main sequence.
Amazing. Well, one of the things that you recently wrote had to do with this idea of orchestration. And you said in an article that the technology to make circular materials is not a pipe dream. It's already here. And what you did was you mentioned a deal that a company called Samsara did with Lululemon. And it took them 10 years to go from the lab bench to get an offtake agreement with Lululemon. And that required really orchestrating an entire ecosystem. Can you walk us through the deal and explain how you think about value chain creation versus just backing science?
Yeah, sure. Samsara is a great example. So it didn't take them 10 years. In fact, I think the great example of Samsara is it's only taken them 4 years so far, and they have a 10-year agreement with Lululemon. Now, the Samsara eco business began 4 years ago with a market pull desire from the big company here in Australia that we ended up co-founding the company with, Woolworths. So Woolworths is our Walmart. It's our big retailer here in Australia. All big retailers, they have this enormous problem of plastic waste. And as we all know, plastic is a fabulous product in all respects until you have to get rid of it at the end of life. And then we have this enormous problem. And Woolworths have this particular problem of mixed bale plastic waste. What happens when you've just got a big pile of plastic? Some of it's PET, some of it's polyester, some of it's polycarbonate, some of it is nylon. What do you do with that? The sorting is as big a problem as the actual recycling of it. And so we wanted to start a company with Woolworths to go after that problem. And this is the sort of first principle of orchestration. We did not find a great founder exclusively and then just put them to work to build a company on their own in their own isolated environment. We knew that we needed to understand exactly how the supply chain works. And we knew we needed pull from a customer that would actually set the momentum very early on in the company's life. So we created this company under a model we have here at Main Sequence, which we call venture science. We call it venture science because when we talk to a research organization, we say this is how venture causes great science to be created inside your organization. And then we co-found companies with founders that bring advantage from the first day. And so in the case of Samsara Eco, the founders were Main Sequence. Our job is to actually bring all the elements together in the early risk capital. A executive founder, as we call it, which is an amazing industry leader here in Australia called Paul Riley, who's still the CEO of the company. Woolworths, as I mentioned, who gave us the access to the market, the understanding and the first bit of pull. And then Australian National University, the ANU, where we discovered this incredible enzymatic technology, which used enzymes at almost room temperature to depolymerize these multiple plastics back to the monomers so that you could, for the first time, infinitely recycle the plastics. But of course, the plastic supply chain, it's not like you make a Samsara widget and then make a website and say, who wants to buy our widget? It's incredibly complicated. It's in different parts of the world. And as we move into the textile side, which I'll come to how we got there, it's very, very particular. A lot of it is in China and Southeast Asia. And then you've got to turn the monomers into polymers. You've got to turn those into threads, and then the threads turn into textiles, and the textiles turn into clothes, and then the clothes are shipped into the different markets. And all of that needs to work so that the cost works at the end. And this is a huge thing that we've been learning. Everything has just got to come down to landing the right industrial endpoint. And so you need to know all the things in there that kind of get to that point. But coming back to Lululemon, we had the benefit of having Woolworths on the first day, which meant we were already a significant company with proof that we could do it because we had the ANU technology. We could show demonstrations of infinite recycling happening at the lab scale. The Woolworths CEO declared it to the market that we've created this company together and this is what we intend to do. And that created quite a noise in the market, which allowed Samsara to be instantly credentialed and to talk to other people. This is what caused a conversation with Lululemon, where we realized that the first polymer that we needed to go after was in fact not PET, but was nylon, because there was no solution for nylon. And so much of the polymer waste is in clothes. And then the mixed bale problem is even bigger because it's all woven into the same. You can't separate what's nylon and what's cotton in this T-shirt. And it was a better business model for Samsara. And it lined up with a strategic, urgent strategy that Lululemon had to pull that technology into market. And the same thing that happened with the Woolworths CEO, Lululemon said, we are going to do this. We're going to do this with Samsara. And they've made a commitment that by 2030, 20% of their clothing is going to be infinitely recycled using the Samsara technology. Now, this is really important, and this is my big push around orchestration at the moment, which I think is an unlock for all of us in this industry, and why Lululemon have led us with a great example. If we look at what Lululemon have done, they have basically said to everybody else that might support Samsara, we want this. We are going to organize our supply chain with Samsara to make this possible, and we are going to commit to this kind of volume and this kind of revenue over the next little while. That's different to funding a startup. If you think about everything that we normally do in startups, is we go to companies like Lululemon and we say, we need you to give us $10 million or $5 million, whatever it is. And they say, well, your company is just too risky. Why should we give you $10 million? And I realize now, especially as a venture capitalist, this is where there needs to be a very strong relationship between the venture capitalists and the corporate off-takers, where we say as venture capital, what we need you to show us is the sort of high fidelity plan for the future that we believe in for this company, that we can see where it's going to go. And then our risk capital should help get the company there. And that's exactly what's happened with Samsara. It has been so much easier than many other companies to bring the capital into the company, to keep it moving forward with confidence and certainty and forward towards Lululemon. And so then Lululemon's more likely to get their outcome. The Samsara is going to be funded. It's not going to end up in a situation that so many of these companies do where they're stuck in a not quite having enough money to build the first of a kind to actually get the result that the companies need, and you're stuck. And so this is the solution we need to solve through orchestration.
Yeah, I'm like so fascinated by this story because when I read it, I am fascinated by the fact that you've got these countries that end up being these dumping grounds for just clothing. I think of the Chilean clothing pile in the Atacama Desert and what that looks like as a business opportunity. And so that was part of the reason why I was like, I got to talk to Phil and get him on the podcast because I want to hear more of the nitty gritty. And so I think we should have another conversation about like, how do we take this idea and move it into these countries where right now they're dumping grounds and they could become manufacturers of these monomers that in turn can be returned to the world and infinitely recycled.
That's right. It's actually feedstock now. And that's going to be the new contested resource, I think, in the future.
Absolutely. So you talked about working in theater as that being your origin. And I've seen you say that being a VC is more like being a movie producer than a banker. And you've also suggested that every entrepreneur should go to drama school because theater teaches you to convince people to join a mission without money. How do you feel like all those ideas connect and how do they shape the way you work with founders right now?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the theatre days, the sort of classic example of how you get started is you would, for example, pitch to an international arts festival that you've got this great idea for a performance that you're going to create. And you say what's going to be happening and who all the characters are and what the staging will look like. And then you create visuals to show what it'll be like. But really, you're a year away from having anything. You haven't had 1 minute in a rehearsal room. You don't know what it's going to look like. All you have is that first narrative about what it might look like. And all that ends up in the brochures for the events. And way back then, you do it kind of a year before. You've got to tell people what to imagine until you have it, before you have it. And then you start using that same collateral, build another layer on it that says why the actors should come and join you and get paid not enough money for too long to start building this whole thing together. And all the other people that you need, you're using it as your recruitment and your capital raising that's still needed for theatre. And you're really doing all this with no money. Perhaps you've had a small prepayment from the arts festival, but essentially you're trying to get everyone to imagine wanting to see something great and come in behind that. And this is why theatre is a very good environment for this, because there's no confusion about money versus the vision. It's the vision drives the creation of something, and the something can't be built without all these people coming together. So you learn that impulse. And I just bring that to startups today. It's not about, because unless you have that, you can't mask it. Unless you have that, you can't bring the whole thing together. It's the same with big companies. I think when we go to a big company or a university to co-found a company or get involved in a company, when we get bogged down in term sheets, the financial transaction of the whole thing, the next moment, we're just looking one step ahead, the gate that we've all got to get through. It's just not exciting enough. And we don't start the company in the right way. If we start the whole company like that posture we have at the beginning of a performance that we're planning to build, and everyone's thinking they can imagine the factory on the hill in the future that's going to be this new sovereign industry or whatever it is that we're building, that's worth going through all the pain that's between here and there and people committing to it and going for it. And so I think that's what I've learned, and that's how I still orchestrate the culture of all the players that are around these businesses.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world?
There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's like you got to have that story and that vision so that you can get your followers and you can bring people along. And if that vision isn't big enough or bold enough or inspiring enough, you're just not going to get it.
That's right. And it just coming back to the sort of movie producer, showrunner type of analogy. I think people often think of a VC as a banker or a sort of capital allocator. And in fact, I think too many VCs actually think of themselves like that today. And I think Silicon Valley of the last 10, 15 years has almost made that worse because Silicon Valley has become software driven and has become such a sort of fertile pool of capital that in Silicon Valley, it's really just a battle of deploying capital and getting enough ownership. And then there's enough of a ecosystem in Silicon Valley for the VC just to allow the ecosystem to go to work and a company to hopefully rise. But I think modern VC has forgotten the origins of VC. The origins of VC that were Boston Semiconductor or something like that, that is hardware, is hard things, is factories, and building companies that have this huge moat around them because they were hard to build in the first place. But you can only build those companies if you have a highly collaborative way, which just brings us back to this sort of producer showrunner. You can't make a movie by saying, hey, John Smith, here's the money, good luck. You bring the talent in, you package the whole thing up, you crowd in finance from all kinds of places, you do the distribution deal. You have to participate in our world of venture building, Carl. It's about biomanufacturing and synthetic biology. If we stay in our silo, it's much less likely to succeed. So we have to take that producer posture.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to using the Samsara example, the fact that they had, first of all, you guys orchestrated the relationship with the Australian university with Woolworths, and then that in turn attracted Lululemon. And I could see, and we do see it, it's like a lot of the startups that we visit or we get to know, it's like they don't have that full vision. And a lot of times it's just because they're very science focused and they're focused on the technology and they're not really thinking about what the greater impact is. And yet we see the same thing on the other end sometimes with the big companies that are looking for a technology or they need a solution, but they don't really understand what this other ecosystem is that they need to build. So I think you're in a really interesting place. I'm looking forward to learning more about the playbook that Main Sequence has developed over the years. But let's go back to Pollenizer for a minute. You said that basically you founded, I don't know how many companies and 70 people for $5 million. There really was no startup ecosystem when you started that. But now you're spinning out global companies from the big research organization in Australia, Cicero. Did you have to build the ecosystem from scratch? And what did it teach you about creating these bigger value chains?
Well, there's a humbleness to doing this, right? Because so much of the work becomes participation. You're not claiming that you've done all the work yourself, but participating and paying attention to the aspects which are removing the blocks around people. If we take where we are today with the research system here in Australia and where we got to with Pollenizer with them, at Pollenizer, we had done the work on figuring out what you do on day one to actually start a company. When someone says, I've got a great idea for the Pollenizer days, it was a restaurant booking app, great business around restaurant bookings, but I don't have an engineering team and I don't know how to do sales and I don't know how to pitch it and I don't know how to raise capital. And so we did all that work to figure out, well, what's the playbook for that? And then that becomes, well, how do you scale that? So who are the other people that can help with that? And how do you connect with them? And what's that way of working. So that just starts to move everything, get the whole system starting to work. Then as we got towards the final years of Pollenizer and the whole system was getting good at that, that's when we started to look at the research system. And CSIRO, which is Australia's national science agency, they have been tasked by the federal government here to try and do something to stimulate the incredible research here and to turn it into companies and to capture the value here in Australia. Now, if you look around the ecosystem at the time, there were no accelerators in the universities. There was no commercial muscle. There was no connection with industry and manufacturing and supply chains. And CSIRO wanted to create a national accelerator program that could just start to move that. And Pollenizer was given the job of designing that and executing that over the first couple of years. And I still remember to this day being in the first boot camp, we called it, and we had 100 scientists from all over the country coming in with their companies. And I asked them to say, tell me what's valuable about what you're doing. And not only did I not understand what they were doing, but no one else in the room understood. It was the quite literal Tower of Babel where no one understood each other. But as we started to find the way of communicating it, I'm thinking, oh, wow, like how incredible are humans that we have this capacity for invention. And look at what these people are making. There's this whole new world of, this was not booking a table at a restaurant. This was removing methane from livestock, and this was whole new foods, and this was quantum computers that would massively revolutionize how we compute in the future. And I was blown away both with the capacity for value creation and the absence of capability to turn that into a company. And that's what began that whole journey. Now, 10 years into the future there, Australia has intervened as a community. Every university has multiple accelerator programs. There's a common language where the Tower of Babel has gone away. Everyone has connection with industry. There's lots more venture capital. Main Sequence is $1 billion under management fund fueling these things. We collaborate with the National Reconstruction Fund here, which is another government program with $15 billion to take what we're doing and move it into industry. This whole thing has blossomed. It comes from, again, coming back to orchestration. It's everybody talking about what we are doing and what we are doing collectively and where there is a gap and how we can help each other. And this is how the ecosystem unfolds the next layer. As somebody that's an old timer and been doing it for 20 years now in Australia, I like to say to people, I'm often asked on panels and podcasts, what's missing and how's it going? And I always say, look, we're doing great. Of course, this thing's missing. And we'll keep building, but look at where we've come from and look at what's happening. So let's just keep going and fill in the gaps as we go.
Well, so one question I want to ask is, since you said that it was this Tower of Babel, all these scientists that you met with, all telling these stories, maybe not even understanding how they could translate into a company. How do you get founders like that, or all founders, to really understand that they need to have an ecosystem script, like a story that gets regulators, corporates, and consumers all playing their parts, but also really excited about what the tech might be?
We create arenas in which that is exposed and where the opportunity is exposed and the gaps are exposed. And we have to work at it, I must say, because I think everybody involved in a company comes at it from their own perspective. So if you're a scientist, it's very common for us to meet scientists who think it's self-evident. If I tell you the performance of my yeast strain, or I tell you about how many qubits I have in my quantum computer, or how many megawatts of energy I can store, it'll be self-evident to everybody that it's valuable. They don't understand that other people are just not seeing the so what from that. They also think that when they say that technical aspect, that then the industry will come rolling in and the supply chain will automatically change and the regulators will say, of course, I've been wanting this for years. Thank you. And of course, as you get to that actual point in your life, you realize there's a headwind. Even pitching, we have very technical co-founders who they're not seeing that in a pitch meeting with a new investor or a customer, and that person is just not seeing why it's valuable. And then you help them. I had an experience just a month or so ago where the founder literally said to me, I don't intuitively understand why it's valuable and why you want me to do this, but I trust you. I'm going to go and do it. And we went through this whole sort of pitch clinic process where he figured out how to share what he's doing. And then he came back and said, I understand, because he'd literally seen all of a sudden the conversations became engaging and people were leaning in and saying, how can we do this together? And it all made sense. Another, just a much bigger example is I'm in the middle of our deep tech week here in Australia, where all our founders and investors come together. And we tried a component of that we called Moonshot Council. Like, how do we convene to look at our collective moonshot? And so, for example, I had a group of government people, CEOs of big industry from different countries, startup founders working in biotech food companies. And we made a list of the blockers that were in place. We then created a series of projects which were inter-company, inter-organizational projects for the year that would actually help us reach this moonshot. And it's just forcing that arena, as I said at the beginning. These things always begin, people go, gosh, is this really going to help? And then at the end of it, it's like, yeah, no.
This was a good example of something I've heard you talk about, which is breaking down the silos of between scientists and commercial teams, like having a moonshot council. But I'm curious about a deeper challenge. How do you help scientists, and you hinted at this, how do you help scientists understand that their breakthrough isn't just a better product? It might require building an entirely new market, really completely transforming a supply chain. How do you coach them to think like ecosystem architects?
Yeah, this is a big problem to solve, because I think scientists, and I'm generalizing, are very uncomfortable talking about something which they haven't absolutely proven. That this is the first sort of cultural thing to navigate between the sort of venture world and then a scientist. And of course, we must do that. We must talk about the evidence we have and what we know and why we should feel very confident about where we are today. But we have to see the beacon on the hill as well. We have to know what's possible. We have to figure out how we can talk about the future state. And there's two reasons for this. One is, as I said before, this is how we get everyone excited to go on what will be a very difficult journey. So everyone has to be bought into an aligned view of the future, understand the future might not end up being exactly what we thought about at the beginning, but if it's anything like it, it'll be exciting and it's worth the effort. But I think the other thing is we need to understand what are the properties of that working successfully at an industrial scale. And I think that so often these products are developed, so they're kind of platform technologies. They're things which would work really well in a big sort of patent IP library, the sorts of things which we think about when we're building IP strength inside a university. But they're just not valuable in terms of getting you to industrial scale. And companies like Samsara, companies like Cauldron, which are a big biomanufacturing company, companies like Ulu that are making new polymers with seaweed as a feedstock, that only matter if you know or you have belief and you have a plan for them working at a big scale. And Michelle, who's the CEO of Cauldron, the biomanufacturing company, she has this great phrase, which is, unless it involves a forklift truck, it's not relevant. And I think that's where we've kind of got to get to. It might be the most remarkable science, but if it will never transfer to pipes and tubes and 500,000 litre bioreactors in that case, it's almost irrelevant. And I think as well, scientists tend to, because they build this sort of broad patent portfolio and technology platform, it becomes a very fat front to kind of move forward into industry. When I look at the biomanufacturing industry, what I see is this fat front of innovation that's stuck here and it can't get through. And I think we just need to be doing less. Scientists need to talk with commercial people, with engineering people that turn what they're doing into factories. And we need to drag this whole thing through to scale. And then when we get it to scale, then that's sending the message back through the ecosystem that what the scientists are doing now is turning into real impactful scale that we should all lean into and make happen. And we had the opening of the first infinite plastic recycling facility in Australia. So big factory that Samsara opened last week. And we had 3 ministers that came from the government to look at the whole thing. And there was this very innocent comment, but it was profoundly important, where one of them said, this is really good because we're often on lab tours around the universities and things. And I quietly think to myself, that's really interesting, but how does that end up manifesting in something that's new jobs, new industry, all these things, which are really important. And so, yeah, we need to get the scientists thinking more about the forklift trucks and how it applies and putting that ingenuity there, and then creating a pathway where we're heading towards the first manifestation of it at scale as fast as possible. And then we can build the breadth from there.
Yeah, I find it super interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned Michelle and Cauldron, who we've had on the podcast and really love and are watching and paying attention to what she's doing. And Cauldron is building this precision fermentation infrastructure. It's almost like precision fermentation as a service. And this is a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure challenge. It just doesn't exist. And what we've seen is that most investors avoid this, but there are some investors who are really interested in infrastructure investments. You guys seem to embrace this despite the challenges associated with it. Are you betting that whoever controls this kind of manufacturing, biological manufacturing infrastructure, is going to control the next economy?
Yeah, that's it. I think that's a good way of putting it. It's very clear from where I'm sitting that the maturation of various technologies combined with the needs that Earth have for different manufacturing systems, all the calls for sovereign manufacturing capability, everything that's happening with geopolitics, there is going to be a great rise in new industrial platforms all over the world that this technology needs to step into. And we need to roll out this infrastructure. That means we need a different approach for sure. But I was talking with another investor last night, and I'm very glad I'm not a software investor, because all I can see is with the rise of AI, these are going to become very volatile, almost temporary businesses with very limited moats around them, right? And so, yeah, we can make them quickly, but that's the problem. Everyone can make them quickly. And I don't want to downplay what it takes to grow a business around a software company. But what we do know is how hard it is to build these big new industrial companies. But once we've got them, and not only have we figured out how to build them at scale industrially, but we've embedded them in a supply chain, that is a very deep moat around these companies. Then those things must grow to a big scale. I mean, the biomanufacturing solution isn't about companies like Cauldron building one factory somewhere. There needs to be hundreds of them all over the world. Samsara needs hundreds of recycling facilities, and that whole stream of industry must flow through them. And that is a huge opportunity. And I often in conversations with my venture peers that we need to find the way of leaning in to CapEx again, like we did in the origins of venture, and to capture this opportunity. And I wish I could see more of it. There aren't enough of us out there doing it, but we're finding ways to do it. One thing I'll say is I think the big problem to solve today is that capital tends to have its own silos, right? So you have angel investors that do a certain kind of investing, have a certain risk profile, will put a certain amount of money in. Venture capital, institutional venture capital, the next little bit, we're also risk tolerant. But venture capital is starting to get really worried if we might get diluted round after round after round whilst new factory gets built. And so at the moment, there's a little bit of a gap between what we do in venture and what project financing institutions deliver. And we're seeing the rise of new funds that are filling in that gap. And there's more and more of those coming. And we've got people on both of those silos, if you like, to stick with that idea. Kind of just trying to reach across and find a way of just touching enough and then just pull a company along. And we'll get better at that. I think that's a little bit of the ecosystem growing and us sort of realizing what we have to do. But there has to be a definite plan. And I think if you and I look back and the listeners look back at the history of these incredible, the companies we see pitch for the first time at Symbiobeta, and then we watch their journey, so many of them get stuck at this second valley of death point, and that makes them weak. It's not their technology that's weak. Technology rarely fails. Technology is rarely the reason for a company to fail. It's usually a human issue or a capital issue or a kind of, getting the cost right to work in industry issue.
But when you think about biomanufacturing, and I think you and I have talked about this before, and we think about distributed biomanufacturing, and like you're talking about Samsara, you're talking about Cauldron, these companies that are building these picks and shovels that are necessary. Is there a model for that? Is there a model that we can look to and say, for me, it's like the microbrewing industry. It's a lot of independent little companies. Sometimes they get bought by a big brewery, but you're able to set up these usually pretty profitable microbreweries anywhere. In the United States, we say everybody's a mile from one. Where I'm sitting in Brooklyn, I probably got 5 within 5 miles, maybe more. But I don't know if investors necessarily see that model as saying, okay, for biomanufacturing, we can replicate that, and we're going to help build like a Cauldron, and we're going to see Cauldron facilities in every country in the world. Are there other models that we could look at that show us that?
The analogy I have to give around industrial biomanufacturing and Cauldron is data centers. These are ultimately massive, expensive pieces of infrastructure. Now, the difference between a biofab that Cauldron might build and a data center is that we know the business model of data centers now. You can go to the bank, you can get project financing. Everyone knows the return on investment that happens there. Everyone knows how it works. You have confidence in the offtake, if you like, and you just build it. You build the next one, you build the next one. And the market has so much momentum that just independently all over the world, people are saying, I'm going to build a data center, build the business case, get the money, get it built. So that's one thing. And I think what that means we have to do as a community around biomanufacturing is we have to force the path to showing this working at scale in the first of a kind, next of a kind of stages. And once we're through that, then whoever you are in the world, it's much easier to do the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one. That's job number one. And for me, that is an unlock, not just directly for companies like Cauldron, Liberation Labs, and all of us that are trying to do these things. It is an unlock for the rest of the industry, because that's how the rest of the industry gets the belief that it can be made at the right price and there is enough capacity out there to do it. That's point number one, just showing that it can be done, and then we can have data center type dynamic in the industry. The second thing is coming back to your question about scientists and founders thinking about how the whole thing is going to work in the future. And what I find, and what I used to do myself, I must say, is you would think about the company doing it all themselves. And you would say, okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to build our pilot plant. And then we're going to raise this much money, and we're going to build our first of a kind commercial facility. And then we're going to list, and then we're going to build the next 10 ourselves. And there's a kind of arrogance to that, which comes from wanting to control it, own the most value. But really, do we want to learn to reinvent the wheel, to do everything that needs to be done there? And really, can we as a single organization that today is 4 years old or whatever, have the audacity to do that and actually have the global impact? And the answer is probably no. So then that leads you to the question, who do we work with in the supply chain? What is our business model so that we grow over time sustainably, but other people are motivated to actually do their part? What I'm now learning, and I'm really enjoying understanding more about, is there are a world of engineering firms, for example, every day, invisible to us innovators, are just rolling out carpets of factories and infrastructure all over the world. And we need to be working with them. And if I look at the Samsara plan now and I think about our board meetings and the work that we're doing, that's what we're doing. I mean, we actually have a plan for the next 50 Samsara facilities, 4-year-old company, and who's building them, how they're motivated, what the business model is. And we're working with all of those people now on the first of a kind. And I think the more we can do that, the more we've got this pathway for scale and impact.
Yeah, I think we need to see more of those because I've got 2 examples. One on a podcast episode we did, and actually both the people have been on podcasts. I'm not going to mention them by name. We'll let our listeners go back. But one, these guys had built like this incredible facility. They're very successful selling product. And when we brought up this idea of, okay, you've got this facility, why don't you replicate the facility in multiple places? Like that thought had never even crossed their mind. I think in many cases, the founders and the companies, as successful as they are, they might not realize that they can multiply their impact by thinking that way. And I get it. They're a founder. They're focused on building a company. You have to be focused. As you say, there's these engineering firms. There's all this other ecosystem that you can build so you could have that bigger impact. But what I'd like to see is not only like the Samsara model roll out, but I'd like to see someone who's been on the podcast where they could take what they're building or they could take what they're doing. They've got a first of a kind facility. They're able to produce a lot of product. I'd like to see them start thinking about, okay, now we can start producing this next to, we can do it in Italy where they're going to use our product. We're going to do it in this place where they're producing shoes. So that way other people can start to see this example kind of multiplying. And I think you pass by the geopolitics that we're living through right now, but I think that this is absolutely necessary. And so it makes it an even more compelling opportunity right now.
It really does. And I think if we take a customer perspective of all these companies that we're working with. So our companies that are making new textiles, our companies that are doing recycling, our customers that are doing new dyes and things like that in fashion. If you're a customer, if you're Lululemon, if you're Nike, if you're fast fashion in Japan, you have to believe that there's going to be sufficient scale for you to go. It's coming back to what I was describing before. You have to know the beacon on the hill. You have to know that there's going to be enough. It's going to be big enough. It's going to be cheap enough, and the company's going to get there. If all the company has got is that single factory, and that's all they're talking about, and it will only do 2% of the capacity that this customer is ever going to need. As a customer, I'm not comfortable anymore. I'm worried. I'm putting my own future in the hands of this subscale startup. And that's another reason why we need to have the sensor.
But how do you think that contrasts with this kind of, there's a trend that I'm seeing too, where you've got these companies that they're really focused on complete vertical integration. They're following like a Tesla or a SpaceX model. And there's other ones where they just want complete control of a supply chain. How does that sync with this thinking?
Well, what companies other than SpaceX and Tesla don't have is the CEO doesn't have billions of dollars of their own money to actually put into the business. And yeah, no question, it's very inspiring to read about how this happens and how SpaceX doesn't buy these expensive components from the existing supply chain and it engineers its own, which is 100 times cheaper and more fit for purpose. And it's, of course, very valuable to do that. But I guess a contrast would be in China, where that whole manufacturing system has been optimized for a supply chain to rise. And we see whole car companies appear in 2 years out of a company that used to make toasters, right? A company that's good at taking in components for other people and then innovating around assembly and then building a big factory and then pushing it out. There's huge scalability in that, and it's reproducible on an industrial scale. It doesn't need Elon Musk specifically with his specific bank account to actually get it there. So it's much more efficient. But I think we always have to be, I'm always careful to say, we can't be religious about these things. We have to say, look, well, what does my company need? And I would say that as a VC looking and participating very closely in biomanufacturing and all of these molecule making incredible innovations that are happening. I think there's been lots of wrong steps, people choosing the vertical integration path. Because what actually happens if you're not Elon Musk, and I know where it comes from, it's because if there is no factory, I must build a factory. This is how I'm in control of my destiny. But there's so many companies which are almost raised enough money. But in the meantime, they're stuck. They're stalled with no factory. Because there's no factory, they can't make at the cost of goods and the volume they need to make. And so they can't do anything. They're in a catch-22 precarious situation. So my general posture at the moment is invest in manufacturing companies that do manufacturing really well, invest in product companies that do products really well, and then stick them together.
To me, it sounds like your approach is fundamentally different from most VC. If you're going to focus on building a tech startup, as well as the person who's going to manufacture it, as well as this distribution infrastructure, what you're really doing is you're creating these systems, you're orchestrating system change rather than just optimizing individual companies. Do you think more VCs should be thinking this way, or do you think that's the evolution we're going to see? You mentioned capital is siloed, and we see that. We want more of that capital to be talking to each other. Do you think we need VCs to kind of move towards this model?
I do. I have a fairly strong belief that gets proven every day that none of us can do this on our own. If we really are in the business of building moonshot companies, then we need Apollo mission style collaboration that brings everyone together. And even VC to VC, we need to know, how do we each get enough returns for our investors by working together on something and then deliver the growth together into the companies. And the more of us that exist in different pockets of the world with our own proprietary relationships with industry, with our own understanding of the market, with our own ability to crowd in capital, and that we do that together, then that's what allows us to keep these companies moving and not failing just purely because there's a missing bit or they're $10 million short or whatever it is. So every day in my work proves to me that when we do that, we're more likely to move forward.
So one of the things that we talk about is that we believe that really the first trillion-dollar biotech company outside of biopharma is going to look more like a lifestyle brand than a traditional tech company. And you're backing companies that are literally changing what we eat, wear, and really how we think about waste and turning waste into infinitely recyclable products. Do you see any of your businesses or any of the companies you guys are investing in becoming cultural movements, not just successful businesses?
Yeah, I think so. And I'd say there's two approaches to this. One is, how do we find the collective narrative around some of this new technology that gets the whole world, first of all, understanding, then comfortable, then excited about something? And I think we do the opposite of that intuitively out of the labs towards industry. And I was at a gathering of the synthetic biology food industry people here in Australia about a month ago. And someone very rightfully said, you guys need to hire a marketing agency. It's not like you, that company, or you, that lab. It's like you as an organization need to have a common story where you're not talking in scientific terms, having horrible phrases like synthetic and genetically modified and all these things. And we need to help the world understand that it's like making wine and it's like making beer and it's like it's nature. We're learning from nature, doing things which will naturally be good for the planet because that's what nature does. It makes things which are sustainable and they work. And having that narrative around things is important. Another part of the narrative is something that VCs do very badly. We talk about disruption. We talk about change. We talk about automation. Now, many of these new industries that we're building are going to rise in regional parts of America and Australia, and they're not capital city. It's not Silicon Valley. This is the point. And all the biotech stuff we're doing here in Australia is going to naturally occur in places where today farmers live there, coal miners live there, people that are pipe fitters and plumbers that work around that industry, they live there. they want to understand why them. What is this business for them? And then they become part of the crowd that wants to make this whole thing happen, not the people that go, get off my lawn. You are not welcome here. And this is what happens all the time. And so there's so many parts to the narrative that we need to get right. That's one thing. And then slightly related to the disruption story, that takes us to the other pathway, which we're doing a lot of work on right now, which is so much of this stuff doesn't need to be a conversation with the public. It's just something we should do for industry, make industry more resilient, make industry more profitable, and just make these new ingredients, help food companies make more money. If we go back to the sort of heady days of the beginning of Impossible Foods and Perfect Day and these early SynBio food companies, think about the rhetoric, the story that we heard. It was ending animal agriculture. It was disruption. It was replacing traditional farming. That served the single purpose of creating an enemy which didn't need to be there. And we were talking about this the other day. It all culminated in a Super Bowl ad that sort of defined ultra-processed food as a concept that just weaponized the whole general public against everything that we were trying to do. Whereas, if we look at where we are today, you've got big food companies that are literally running out of planet to actually make the raw materials to make the products that they want to make. And we all have a solution with these next generation food products, for example, in the food industry that we're making. Same thing in fashion that I know you're involved with a lot. It's harder for these big capitalism driven companies to just keep taking oil-based products to make these. It just gets harder and harder to do it. We have a solution, and doing it in a hybrid way, almost silently to consumers in some places. As long as everyone's making money and the whole thing works, then that's a good way to do it as well.
Yeah, it's amazing. Phil, you and I could keep talking for the next couple hours, but I want to be mindful of your time. So what I'd like to do, if you're okay with it, is do some quick fire questions before we say goodbye. What's a scientific breakthrough in your portfolio that becomes critical infrastructure for reshaping industry?
I think I would have to say for this conversation, it's Cauldron's HyperFermentation technology, because it delivers the solution to companies making products at the right price, at the right volume, through building a global tapestry of infrastructure which isn't too expensive. And so it's an unlock for all the companies that are making, especially commodity priced products with biology.
Yeah, very excited about Cauldron. I'm looking forward to talking to Michelle again soon. Beyond storytelling, what's the single most important skill you teach founders?
Synthesis. How to look at the whole environment around you, how to listen to everybody, and how to reform that into your own thinking on strategy. So you're always learning, but always bringing everything together into cohesive direction.
And this isn't really a quick fire because it's like we could have a whole episode about this, but collaboration versus competition. Why?
Because, first instance, there's no point in competing in a market that doesn't exist yet. The first job we have to do is to make the market together and then go for your life and compete with each other. And also, I think that especially in the domain of what are the collective stories and things like that we were just talking about, when people compete early, they generally attack their own value proposition as well. Because what they say to the market around them is, that synthetic biology company is really bad for these 5 reasons. And then that company is really bad for these 5 reasons, but we're really good. But what the market hears is 5 bad, something good. And then you add all that up, and all people hear is all the reasons to be worried about synthetic biology companies. And instead, what we need is a way of collaborating on what is the consistent way of all of us rising as an industry with a common story. And then we can compete.
Couldn't agree with you more. What's an unconventional metric that deep tech founders should be tracking?
I thought this was the best question I've ever been asked. And it's really got me thinking, because I want to think about more of them. But the one I landed on for this podcast was organizational velocity. So how do we track how fast we make decisions? Who's involved? How do we make the decision? How quickly do they make the decision? And this is very important because these companies have to decide quickly. You've got engineers, scientists, and commercial people all deciding together. Together, they can slow each other down. That slowness creates burn on a daily basis, which makes the company more fragile. We need to figure out how to move forward quickly. Different companies will measure that organizational velocity in a different way, but it's just things like we look at speed of decision making on our boards, for example, so that we're all part of the same culture to get that done.
Amazing. And what do you think the biggest advantage Australia has over Silicon Valley?
I think for all science-driven companies, one of the most valuable things we have is we have a tax benefit here called the R&D tax credit. And this is where anyone doing R&D in Australia gets half of that money back every year as a tax credit. And if I look at all of our companies, you look at the burn down cash chart, it looks like a sawtooth. It goes down and then up, and then down and then up. And those up motions are when the R&D tax credit comes in. And if you think of that in terms of runway for a startup, it moves the line out. So you get like an extra year for free of development, which is extremely valuable and not anywhere else in the world. And then that combined with, unfortunately, for the rest of the world, which has got quite a volatile geopolitical landscape, we are very stable here. We're probably going to have the same government for at least 2 cycles. And so this is a good place to sort of come and sort of dig into getting things done. And just finally, with biotech that you and I are just so passionate about, we are the second biggest agricultural landmass in the world. We have a lot of feedstock, both primary feedstock that we grow, like sugarcane, and then we have all the waste that comes out the other side of that, which is now the sort of feedstock of the future. So Australia is the company to build a global scale biotech industry.
Amazing. Well, Phil, I thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. We could have spoken for another 2 hours, but I want to be mindful of your time, and so we'll have to just have another conversation.
Always would love to do that, Carl. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm super sorry you weren't there for that interview, but you listened to it. What did you think?
Yes, it was great. I just loved his background. We always talk about people from other industries coming into biotech, and I don't know a farther industry from biotech than theater.
Theater,
I think it's probably the farthest. If there's a spectrum of careers, this goes to show that anyone can do it. Anyone can come into biotech, and biotech investing. Wow. I mean, I just love to hear the trajectory of his career. And it's also that's the similarity of when people talk about being better at sales, they should go to do improv. Improv is a great way to learn to do sales, but it looks like theater is a great way to get into biotech venture capital and this idea of ecosystem orchestration. I'm so happy that you had someone with such great experience that's doing it on the podcast and sharing their perspective. But tell us some of the highlights for you. You were there. You've had conversations with Phil beforehand, and you've been thinking deeply about this.
There's a couple of things that really stood out to me. One was this idea of collaborating even before there's a market created for a product or technology. And I just thought Phil's view on that was so on point because he said that, why are you competing if the market doesn't exist? And we see that over and over again, like 10 companies will start with a certain technology that's going to address a certain problem. And Phil even makes a point that the moment you start denigrating the competition, you're basically denigrating yourself. So I think there's a lot of room for collaboration at the beginning and trading notes with each other. And I think that people who are successful faster understand that, and they tend to look for ways that they can collaborate with their competitors from the beginning.
Yeah, it's such a psychological shift from capitalism to actually doing business in reality, right? You have to compete. You have to get all the resources. You have to scale up all on your own so you can take all the revenue and have full control. I just love the fact that you and Phil had this conversation because that's not the way to operate. That's not the way biology operates. Maybe on the multicellular organisms scale, but even then, successful societies or organizations of organisms share resources. They share resources and there's a value chain created. when it comes to energy on the cellular level. I don't know if my analogy is breaking down, but, but you know what I'm saying, right? It's like this push and pull from collaboration and competition. It's a dance to be played, but it is a dance. There's nuance. And to be able to know when to collaborate versus compete is where the magic happens. And before this podcast, we were talking about things that are going on in the United States and how things are changing and the perspectives changing. Our role in the world is changing here just from the decisions that are made by our current leaders. And I know I'm pulling on a thread that's going to make us go down a rabbit hole, but when we did have this time where we were more collaborative, there was more of like a soft power leadership. Everyone had a role. China manufactures, United States purchased. And like there were environmental challenges there, but then there were great prosperity that happened on both sides. So we just need to learn and optimize. Are we learning and optimizing right now? I don't know.
I mean, look, I think that we can take a hugely macro view and just say, look, there's only one planet so far. And so, collaboration makes sense. If anything, the post-World War II order really set the world up for a lot of collaboration, and that collaboration did raise a lot of wealth across the planet. It lifted so many people out of poverty. It made so many people healthier. And it enabled this world that I think in many cases we take for granted. And this idea of isolating a country or isolating a technology and preventing other people from using it, what happens when you do that is people innovate around it. And I think the example I'll use is just the DeepSeek moment that happened earlier in 2025, where this company seemingly came out of nowhere with a LLM model that they developed very quickly and which was very powerful. And they didn't do it on like the state-of-the-art NVIDIA chips. And so it just demonstrated that people will always find a way to innovate. And people want to collaborate. Science is a very open field. Scientists like to collaborate with each other. They're always trying to advance knowledge. And I would argue even capitalists like collaboration, because if you're collaborating, it allows you to look at a market, from a more macro point of view. And then that in turn allows you to understand where the places where you can make a difference and turn a profit if we want to go in that direction. But I thought that Phil didn't get into the politics of things that much, but I think we could have gone down in that direction. And Australia has a super interesting ecosystem for innovation and deep tech investment. And we've had a number of people on the pod. We've had Michelle Stanfield of Cauldron on here, and that's an example. And we've also had, I'm going to pick on biomanufacturing for a second, because last year we had a lot of biomanufacturing companies on the podcast. It's incredibly important. It requires a lot of collaboration, and that is going to require a lot of capital being deployed around the world to build these facilities that in turn will turn a profit and will enable companies to build locally what maybe in the past used to be shipped around the world. I find that to be very exciting.
Yeah. Yep. Manufacturing locally to your customers that are local as well. But I think that's remains to be seen. That's the end state, right? I mean, we need to probably ship around the world until for a while. Yeah. And I did like Phil's comment. He's talking about if you're wearing your investor hat and where they're putting their money. And it's like invest in manufacturing that does manufacturing really well, and then invest in product companies that do product well. Because if you invest in a company that wants to do product, but also manufacturing, it gets really crazy. And we had a conversation with our friend Seth about this. We talked to a company and we're like, all right, are they a biomanufacturing company because they're doing something completely new? Or are they creating an end product? And this company was doing both. And it's like, and they were raising a little bit of money. So does the math? Does this make sense from an investment standpoint? Or do they require collaborators? Are they going to decide to collaborate with a manufacturing company and then just focus on products so that the investors are actually investing in the product, not the manufacturing of the product? Or are they going to invest in the manufacturing and then have that platform play, right? Manufacturing is a platform, right? Are you making a platform to make other products, or are you going just focus on the product and then find the partners and find the ecosystem to help you? Because that comment you made about capitalism and like what's the end state? Yeah, the end state of capitalism is money to your shareholders, right? So how do you optimize so you can reduce your OpEx so that you can then distribute more money up the value chain of owners of the company?
I'll just point out that one of the things that really stood out to me too in this interview with Phil is I asked him in the quick fire what he teaches entrepreneurs besides narrative. Given his theater background, telling a story was very important. And he talked a lot about the importance of that narrative to get people excited about what a company is doing. And then I asked him, well, what's important besides narrative? And he said synthesis, and really meaning taking this holistic view of collaborators, investors, the marketplace, potential buyers, and being much more ecosystem focused.
Yes.
So I just loved that. I think part of the reason why I wanted to have him on was I wanted other people to hear that collaboration story from Samsara and Lululemon to understand how that value chain was created. I will point out also that, as we were recording the podcast, Samsara was opening their first facility, which is a humongous facility in Australia that's going to be able to process tons of material and deliver these monofibers that will be recycled infinitely. So very, very exciting to see that.
Yes. And we'll be talking more about ecosystem orchestration with our guests, because you're right, Carl, this is the way that we need to think. We just need to think bigger. And that's what you hear on the Grow Everything podcast, where we look at the whole industry and how everything is connected to each other. Everything from innovators to investors to consumer product goods companies to biopharma to the consumer. And we really want to look at this whole ecosystem. Yes, we talk about venture capital sometimes, but capital needs to be talking to each other, whether it's from VCs, whether it's from the government, whether it's from consumer, whether it's from corporate ventures. How do we all talk to each other, get the financing to flow into the development of these new, innovative, sustainable, and high-performing products that biology enables?
I think that's the perfect way to end this episode of the Grow Everything podcast.
Yes. So subscribe, be our friends, write to us. We were so happy to see so many people at Climate Week, at the BioFab Fair, and more events to come, more episodes to be had. Thank you so much for tuning in to the pod.